There's some good lawyering going on in the Kohberger matter. The Gilgo beach murder suspect has to give up his DNA. The armorer on the Rust movie set has a trial date. Todd and Julie Chrisley are totally desperate, and they're going to lose. And then finally, our dumb criminal of the day. Let's talk about it. Good day, everyone. My name is Scott Reich, and this is Crime Talk. Thanks for joining us. You know the drill. Subscribe if you haven't, like if you do, leave me a comment below, and remember, you can listen to us anytime on any of your favorite podcasting apps. All right, let's go ahead and get to the docket. So let's open the record for August 10th of 2023. First, there is some good lawyering going on in the Bryan Kohberger matter. And I mean from the defense attorneys. Let me explain. So the lawyers for Bryan Kohberger have put forward a statement by a genealogist that is trying to cast doubt on the reliability of the genetic genealogy, which investigators use to track down and identify Bryan Kohberger as the suspect in the quadruple homicide there in Moscow, Idaho. Now, the detectives relied upon genetic genealogy to build their case against the Mr. Kohberger, as they used the method to build a DNA profile from the DNA left on a knife sheath at the scene, and then matched that to a profile to Bryan Kohberger's father just days before his arrest. Now, while prosecutors claim they matched the DNA from the knife sheath directly to Mr. Kohberger after he was arrested, they first used genetic genealogy, and his defense so far has focused on scrutinizing the process used by the investigators to collect evidence and build the DNA profile, arguing it could have been flawed and is ultimately unconstitutional. So in their most recent motion, they request the data and methods used by investigators to match the DNA evidence to Bryan Kohberger. And in her affidavit, which I've reviewed, it goes for several pages. It's actually quite interesting, but I'm going to give you the highlight points from it here. Anyway, Dr. Larkin argues that DNA profiles built by at-home test companies such as 23andMe and Ancestry DNA are not constructed the same way as those by specialized laboratories and are therefore not reliable. Dr. Larkin notes that the sites such as Ancestry DNA, 23andMe, and MyHeritage prohibit forensic investigative genetic genealogy in their databases, but there isn't really a way to enforce that rule. So in the absence of an effective oversight, forensic genetic genealogists are on an honor system to obey the terms of service and the Department of Justice interim policy on forensic genetic genealogy. Dr. Larkin explains that the science used by these sites is not perfect, and any given amount of a centimorgan, that's an amount of DNA, can represent more than one possible relationship. She notes one example that has nearly 20 possible relationship lines listed for a match and says that's considered a close match. Larkin points out that the genetic genealogy testing identifies possible relatives, unlike DNA tests that find an individual, which are standard forensic STR tests. The doctor also notes cases where she's allegedly become aware of where genetic genealogy has been wrong and where authorities misused the database. Now, the FBI, as you recall, tracked down Kohberger by tracing his distant relatives through genetic genealogy databases, secretly collecting a sample of his father's DNA to confirm his identity. Police say the DNA found on the knife sheath left at the Idaho murder scene is a statistical match to a cheek swab taken from the suspect after the arrest. Now, a sample of the DNA left on the sheath is at least 5.37 octillion more times likely to be seen if the defendant is the source than any other individual randomly selected from the general population. Now, Mr. Kohberger has no prior criminal history, meaning his DNA was not in any law enforcement database. That's why they turned to genetic genealogy. And genetic genealogy is an increasingly popular and useful method of investigation where law enforcement trace suspects' relatives on ancestry websites. And so when the DNA is found at the scene of the crime, that does not belong to the victims. The first thing the police do is run it through their own database to check if it matches any DNA of a previous offender. This process is referred to as a short tandem repeat, STR, comparison, and tests the sample against 20 DNA markers, enough to identify the person if their own DNA is already in the system, or in some cases, if the DNA of an immediate relative is in the system, for example, like a parent or a brother or sister. If both strike out, investigators have to look to genetic genealogy to perform a wider search for more distant relatives. Unlike police DNA databases, those of commercial genealogy companies can search for up to 1 million DNA markers using a single nucleotide polymorphism, which is not an STR, creating a much wider pool of relatives to sift through. Now, while many commercial ancestry websites exist, only 2 allow law enforcement to search their databases openly: GED Match and Family Tree DNA. Now, once the suspect is narrowed down, genealogical investigators turn their findings over to the police. Undercover or covert teams then follow the suspect and surreptitiously obtain a sample from them to compare it to the sample found at the crime scene used in the DNA tracing. As you may already know, Kohberger is accused of stabbing to death students Ethan Chapin, Madison Mogan, Zaina Kernodle, and Kaylee Gonsalves back on November 13th of 2022. And the detectives found the K-bar knife sheath on the bed with the bodies of Mogan and Gonsalves. The sheath was partially under Mogan's body and the comforter on the bed, according to the affidavit that we've seen. Now, investigators later matched the DNA on the sheath to the DNA found in a trash taken from Kohberger's parents back in Pennsylvania when he was arrested in December of 2022. So what this really means is, ladies and gentlemen, is the defense has a bad fact on their side. That bad fact is Bryan Kohberger's DNA on the K-bar knife sheath. Any good defense attorney is going to say, all right, what piece of evidence do we need to disappear to make us have a defendable case? Clearly, it's the DNA. The prosecution has been asked, and they have rejected to turn over anything as related to their genealogical collection, analysis, survey, whatever you want to call it. And they're saying, we don't have that anymore. You're not entitled to it, etc. And up to this point, the defense really hasn't made a showing to the court that the information should have to be turned over. The prosecution has basically said, well, we arrested him, and then we got a DNA swab by court order, and we're going to go back and double check that. And if that's his DNA, good to go. If it's not, it's good for Bryan Kohberger. More than likely it is. Kind of come back and be a match. But the defense is saying, hey, we're entitled to this information because we believe that it was obtained basically unconstitutionally because, well, there was government action. Were they searching somewhere where they could find his DNA? It's going to get interesting. Like I said, the defense hadn't made a showing. However, the affidavit by the expert, Dr. Larkin, I think forces the court to have a hearing on this, and they'll have the doctor testify, and then somebody's going to have to come from the prosecution as a witness and testify as to what they did. May just ultimately get turned over. This is good lawyering. They have turned a basically non-issue into an issue that if there is a conviction, it is an issue preserved for appeal. Next, the Gilgo murders. Yes, yesterday we brought you the story that the defense attorneys for Rex Heuermann, the alleged Gilgo serial killer, were trying to avoid a buccal swab being taken from Mr. Heuermann so the, prosecutor can test that and compare it to the DNA samples that they have already found on various items of evidentiary value. I said it'd be pretty unlikely for the defense to win this particular motion, and yes, after we filmed, the judge ruled that Mr. Heuermann had to give a sample. It's pretty simple. You have no expectation of privacy, and when you do, the prosecution just simply has to get a court order. I was in court this morning. They took my client's DNA. They also got an order for fingerprint and palm print analysis. You can object for the record, but it's coming. They're going to come take your DNA and your fingerprints. Next, the Rust trial. Well, remember the armorer, Hannah Gutierrez? Well, she now has a trial date. She appeared in court yesterday and entered a plea of not guilty to the charge of involuntary manslaughter, not guilty to tampering with evidence charges as well. Now, the district court judge entered a scheduling order in the case and set the trial dates to commence from December 6th through December 15th, and they're going to start that jury selection process on December 5th. Now, Ms. Gutierrez-Reed worked as the armorer on the set where Alec Baldwin was the actor in the film. Oh, and that's, by the way, Alec Baldwin shot the gun that killed the cinematographer, Helena Hutchins. Hutchins was killed on the set there in New Mexico, and the director, Joel Souza, was wounded by a bullet from the weapon that Baldwin was holding while rehearsing a scene in the church there on October 21st of 2021. Now, Baldwin has denied that he ever pulled the trigger of the gun, and the charges of involuntary manslaughter were ultimately dropped because, well, let's just say the prosecutors made a decision back in April that new facts had been revealed and required further investigation. Well, those new facts were that basically they broke the gun when they were testing it, and so they can't really say that it worked properly. Yes, interesting, is it not? Now, in the motion to dismiss, the special prosecutor noted that the further investigation and forensic analysis that is required couldn't be completed before Baldwin's preliminary hearing, which was scheduled for May 3rd, and that case has been closed since the judge granted the dismissal of the charges. That case seems to go on and on. The question is, will Alec Baldwin be a witness in the trial? He still has Fifth Amendment protection, so it may be a little hard for the prosecution to get what they're looking for in this particular case, which is a conviction. We'll watch it. We'll let you know. Next on the docket, the Chrisleys, Todd and Julie Chrisley. Yes, if you've ever watched their show, it was probably one of the most annoying reality shows on TV. Never really was sure how the guy made any money. Never sure exactly what they did, but it was just a little weird. Well, as you may recall, they got convicted. Todd and Julie Chrisley got convicted of basically not paying their taxes, a big chunk of taxes for lots of years. And now they're both in prison. And we brought you a story the other day that the Chrisleys are upset, that the IRS agent lied in order to get them convicted, and that they should have been granted in-home confinement, even though, like I said, they've been convicted of tax fraud, money laundering, and they filed an appeal basically asking that they be allowed to serve their sentence on in-home detention. When that subject was brought up, I chuckled, I laughed, I guffawed, and I said there's no way they're going to get in-home detention when they've been given 13 and 9-year sentences, respectively, in the Federal Bureau of Prisons. It doesn't work that way. You're in the feds. You've hit the big time. You're going to prison. You're going to serve 85% before you're released on supervised release. But that does not stop the Chrisleys. They are going to appeal, and they're going to appeal all the way to the Supreme Court if they need to, through their new attorney, they say. Well, let me give you some advice. You've committed a $30 million tax fraud scheme, which you were convicted of. If you thought the IRS agent lied, guess what? I'm sure your attorney cross-examined that IRS agent vigorously, and the jury rejected your attorney's claim that he was unlawfully or untruthful, and therefore you were convicted. Appeals have to do with legal errors, somehow that the judge allowed evidence in or didn't allow evidence in that resulted in an unfair trial. Just because you didn't think that a witness was credible and the jury found them credible is not an issue to be raised on appeal, Mr. Chrisley. My advice to you is, yes, maybe there's something will come from your appeal. I'll give you that. And when the Federal Circuit Court denies your appeal, you can file for a writ of certiorari to the United States Supreme Court, which has about 0.0001 chance of being accepted. Somebody needs to go tell the Chrisleys that so they can begin to face their new reality. And next, finally, our dumb criminal of the day. I'm not good at shoplifting. That's right. That's what Daniel Katzmar said when he came in contact with the police. That's what they consider a spontaneous admission, and it came out following his arrest for swiping a bicycle pump, lock, and inner tube from the Walmart in Largo, a city near Tampa Bay. Well, police allege that Mr. Katzmar parked his bike with a flat tire outside of the Walmart before entering into the store and stashing roughly $35 worth of items under his T-shirt. The store security spotted Katzmar in action and alerted police, who arrested him once he left the building. Yes, they wait till you leave the building to show that you had the intent to permanently deprive. And when the police made contact with him, he said, "I'm not good at shoplifting." Well, you would think he would be getting better since he has a rap sheet that includes 2 prior shopliftings. Yes, and don't be surprised, they were at Walmart. Well, needless to say, Mr. Katzmar, in his not good skills at shoplifting, have wound him up in custody on a $2,000 bond. Yes, Mr. Katzmar, you are a dumb criminal of the day. You know you're not good at it. I understand normally. Identify your weaknesses and seek self-improvement, but not when it comes to stealing. That's not good. That just makes you a dumb criminal of the day. All right, that's all we have for today. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.